Hello friend, welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. Before we get started, I would love it if you would join the Brat Pack by subscribing and clicking that bell or ringing that bell or hitting that bell. I put out new videos every week, both true crime and beauty related, and I would love to hang out with you. That would bring me such joy. So today, we're going to be covering one of the most famous true crime cases, at least of my entire lifetime. This video is going to be on the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in 1994, otherwise known as the O.J. Simpson murders because O.J. Simpson was arrested and accused of committing these murders, but was famously and shockingly found to be not guilty of the crimes, which is, at least now, considered to be a grave miscarriage of justice. I mean, I think we can all kind of agree that, but that wasn't the case at the time that it happened, and we are going to discuss that. I had considered not actually doing this video, at least not right now, when I thought about everything that's going on in our world right now, as far as our combined fight towards civil justice in our country right now. But I do think that it is relevant and important, maybe especially right now, to see an example of a community's mistrust in the police, which inevitably led to an allegedly guilty man getting away with murder. So we're going to be discussing the crimes, the trial, the verdict, and my opinion on the verdict, and why, with all of the evidence stacked so heavily against O.J. Simpson, the jury was compelled to give a verdict of not guilty. And man, I warn you now that this is going to be a long one. I've looked at my notes, and I have 11 pages of notes, so so this is probably going to be my longest video yet. So buckle up, you know, grab a drink, grab some snacks, grab your makeup to get ready with me, whatever it is that people say before presenting long videos. Do that. And let's just go ahead and get into discussing the O.J. Simpson murders. Okay, so Orenthal James Simpson, or O.J. Simpson as we will call him the rest of this video, was born July 9th, 1947, which makes him a Cancer. And O.J. was born in San Francisco to parents Eunice and Jimmy Lee Simpson, and he was one of 4 children. O.J.'s parents separated in 1952, which wasn't a huge shock because Jimmy Lee, O.J.'s father, who was, by the way, a famous drag queen in the Bay Area, had actually come out as gay, and so obviously his relationship with a woman did not succeed, right? Duh. So after the separation, O.J. did live with and was primarily raised by his mother, and they struggled financially. And around this time that his parents were separating, when O.J. was 5 years old, he actually developed a condition called rickets, which is essentially like a softening of the bones in kids. I believe it's only in kids. I think I read that. And he was on like crutches because of it, or was it leg braces? They were braces. And he'd already had this disease throughout his younger years, and when he was 5, he got the braces removed. The condition he had with his legs did not hold O.J. back, however, because in school he was known as being a super good athlete, but not a very good student as far as academics go. But he was really good at sports, in spite of his debilitating, you know, soft bones, right? Soft bones. So O.J. was able, growing up, to focus all of his energy into sports, and he ended up actually being one of the greatest college football players of all time. That's what he's known for football. Before murdering people, he was known for football. He was actually able to play football when he went to junior college in 1965, and he got recognized for how truly good he was at the sport. He was then able to transfer to the University of Southern California, where again he was able to show off his sports-like skills. During this time in 1967, O.J. actually married his first wife named Marguerite, and the two had 3 children together. Unfortunately for the couple, their youngest child drowned in a pool in 1969. And I imagine this was, I mean, obviously this would be incredibly difficult on a couple to lose their child, but on top of that, the same year, the year that they lost their child, O.J. was actually, he was drafted into the professional football league, the NFL. He was drafted into the NFL the same year that his child died, so I imagine that takes a lot of time away from the family, and the couple started to grow apart. And it was while playing professional football that O.J. acquired his famous nickname, which was the Juice, because O.J. orange juice, the juice. The juice. And OJ was able to make him a name for himself in pro football. In 1978, he was actually traded from the Buffalo Bills, which is where he had been the team he was drafted into. I don't know a lot about sports, so if my terms aren't right, I'm sorry, but he was traded from the Buffalo Bills to the team for his hometown of San Francisco, the 49ers. And he stayed with the 49ers until the end of 1979. And 1979 was just a year of endings for OJ, because that's also the year that he divorced from his first wife, Marguerite. Retiring from football, which he did in 1979, was not the end of OJ's claim to fame though, because by this time he had kind of become a household name. He was indicted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1985 and had a huge fan base following him at this point. He went on to become a spokesperson for the Hertz car company, and he appeared in all the company's commercials, like running really fast, like doing football-y stuff, but in like a suit for Hertz cars. And he also did small acting jobs in movies. I don't think I've ever seen a movie that he was in, but I've seen clips of movies that he was in, and he seemed just to play like comedies, just like bit roles, things like that. But he was in them and people recognized him and people knew him, and he was very famous. Growing up poor in San Francisco, just living with a single mother and becoming what he had sort of like that started from the bottom, now I'm here energy, and he became sort of a hero in his community because of how successful he was able to make himself. Now, though OJ didn't divorce his first wife till 1979, OJ met his second wife in 1977, so there was a little bit of overlap there. Her name was Nicole Brown, and the two met while he was visiting a nightclub that she worked at while he was still married. She was 18 and beautiful, he was 30 and super successful and famous, and the two just clicked right from the beginning. The two were completely obsessed with each other, and anybody who knew the couple in those early days thought that they were perfect for each other. It was the fairy tale that everybody wanted. The two were married in February of 1985, and they had 2 children together, but the marriage had a lot of problems, which we're gonna get into later, and Nicole ended up filing for divorce only 7 years later in 1992. Okay, so now we're gonna fast forward a little bit to June 12th, 1994, and this is the day of the murders. So OJ, who's now 46, and Nicole, who's now 35, are divorced, and they're living in separate homes, both in Brentwood, California. Is it called Brentwood, California? I think so. Yes, they're both living in homes in the same area, just a couple of minutes drive from each other so that they can co-parent. I imagine they wanted to stay close to each other. But that's also me just speculating. I'm not sure about that, but that's what I'd imagine. I don't know why else they would choose to stay. So the evening of that day, Nicole and OJ's daughter had a recital that they were all going to, and Nicole attended that recital with her family. OJ arrived late, but with flowers for their daughter, and it said that Nicole was sort of like cold to him, to the point that he actually sat by himself and did not sit with Nicole and the rest of her family. So after the recital, Nicole and her family were supposed to go to a restaurant where OJ's son worked, but she changed her plans to go to a more budget-friendly restaurant, and the family instead went to a restaurant called Mezzaluna, and OJ was not invited to attend this dinner. The family arrived at the restaurant at about 6:30, and this restaurant is actually where Nicole's new 25-year-old friend worked, whose name was Ron Goldman. You remember from the beginning, Ron Goldman is the person who would tragically die tonight alongside Nicole. Ron and Nicole had met a couple of months prior to the murders, and the two grew very close very quickly. There were rumors that there was some sort of romance between the two, but it was always denied, and all we know for sure is that they were close friends and would go out to like coffee and go to clubs and just spend time together. So after dinner, the family left the restaurant, and upon arriving home, Nicole's mother realized that she had left her glasses at the restaurant. So at about 9:15, Nicole's sister called the restaurant to let them know, and Ron kindly offered to bring the glasses back after he got off work that night, which is why he was even at Nicole's in the first place, which, man, wrong place, wrong time, am I right? That's so... And I never knew that about this case. I always assumed that he was just there and that's what prompted OJ. Like, before I really learned about this case, I was like, oh, he showed up and she had another guy there and that's why he was in a rage. But no, he was just there by chance. And we'll get into that a little more when we talk about the actual crime. So during this time, between 9 and 9:30, OJ and his friend Brian Kalin, who's just gonna go by Kato, that's what he goes by, that's what people know him as in this case, they went to McDonald's for dinner. That's where they were during this time. The two were there till 9:45, and they presumably went back to OJ's property, Kato living in a guest house that was on the property. So between 9:45 p.m. and 10 p.m., that's when Ron Goldman leaves his job at Mezzaluna and starts heading to return the glasses to Nicole. So it is generally believed that the murders took place at about 10:15 p.m. and that's when neighbors started to hear Nicole's dog crying and whining loudly. Now, on this night, OJ was actually scheduled to leave on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Chicago at 11:45 p.m. So at 10:25, OJ's limo driver arrived and he started buzzing the buzzer to be let onto the property because he had a big gate and nobody answered. So around 10:40 p.m., Cato, who's living in the guest house, heard 3 really loud thumps on the wall of his guest house. But not knowing what it was, he chalked it up to being an earthquake because Los Angeles, there's always earthquakes, and that's why he noted the time. So between 10:25 when the limo driver arrived and 11 p.m., the limo driver tried buzzing OJ over and over and over and did not receive any answer. But he reports that just before 11 p.m., he saw a figure walking through OJ's property that was approximately 6 foot tall and 200 pounds that he claims looked like OJ. Shortly after seeing this figure disappear, he buzzed again, and this time OJ did respond to him saying that he was running late, he had just gotten out of the shower, and he would be down shortly. OJ made his 11:45 flight from Los Angeles to Chicago. The bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were found on her property at 12:10 a.m. So apparently Nicole's dog had gotten free from the yard during her attack and started bark and was like out on the street and was barking like crazy when the dog was discovered by 2 of Nicole's neighbors. The dog then led the neighbors back to Nicole's property where they observed blood, and there was a lot of blood. The scene was insane. So Nicole was laying inside her yard on the front steps, and Ron Goldman was to the side in the fetal position. Ron had been stabbed more than 20 times and he had defensive wounds on his hands and I believe also on his feet, which shows that he put up a fight, which makes sense because Ron was 25 years old and he was the same height as OJ, I remember that, and 20 years younger, and I believe he was also trained in self-defense, so he would have put up a fight. It's thought that Ron actually showed up after Nicole had been killed and that he just sort of stumbled upon the scene and was killed just as, you know, cleanup so that whoever had killed Nicole wouldn't be caught. So the murderer was likely surprised by Ron's presence, and that would explain why so many items from the murderer were left on the property like there had been a scuffle. It would also explain why later the blood of O.J. Simpson was found at the murder scene. Ron was probably fighting pretty hard and pretty aggressively, and unfortunately Ron was murdered just 2 weeks shy of his 26th birthday. Nicole was stabbed a total of 12 times, with the fatal stab being in her throat, nearly severing her head. And at the time that this was happening, Nicole and OJ's children were in the condo asleep upstairs. So obviously officers arrived at the property and they found a lot of evidence that they bagged and kept, including a knit beanie that was presumably worn by the killer, a blood trail leaving the property, a bloody footprint, and the ever so famous in this case, bloody glove. So at 5 a.m., 4 police officers actually leave Nicole's property and head over to O.J. Simpson's property to inform him of his wife's death. The officers state the reason they did this is because O.J. Simpson was a famous man and they wanted to inform him before the media got a hold of the story. When the police arrived, the gate was locked, but there were lights on in the house and cars in the driveway, so the police believed that somebody was home at that time. Though we know that O.J. had already left for his flight and had already left the state. He was already on his flight at that point. I left at 11:45. He may have been there by then. I don't even know how long it takes to fly to Chicago. So the cops tried to buzz to get into the property, obviously, but there was no response, so they were just waiting outside to get a response. And while this was happening, a detective by the name of Mark Furman, who's gonna come into play a lot later in the story, he notices a white Bronco parked on the street in front of the property and decided to run the plates, and in doing so he saw that it belonged to O.J. Simpson. He then notices what he believes to be blood on the car above the door handle of the vehicle. So the officers wait about 45 minutes and when they don't get any response, seeing the blood, they choose to have Officer Furman hop the fence to let the other officers onto the property. So officers say that the reason they hopped the fence and gave themselves access to OJ's property without getting permission is because in seeing the blood and not getting a response and believing somebody was home, they thought that perhaps OJ himself had been a victim of some sort of crime and that he too could be in danger. And I gotta be honest, I do not believe that that is true. During the trial, the defense said that this reasoning was bullshit and that the reason they actually entered the property is because they believed OJ was probably a suspect, and they used this blood as a reason to enter just as kind of a cover, because you do need a reason, but if you have probable cause, you can enter. And I actually do agree with this, because in taking my administration of justice class, my teacher, who used to be a cop, said that all they have to do is have a reason, and I believe that that's what was happening here. I do. So while they were on the property checking on OJ, they sure found a lot of evidence against him. So while searching, Officer Mark Furman found a bloody glove that matched the bloody glove at the crime scene, and he found it behind the guest house, exactly where Cato had heard the 3 bangs prior in the evening. Another officer found a blood trail that had led from the Bronco through the driveway and into OJ's home. Inside the home, blood was found in at least 2 bathrooms, and a bloody sock was also found in OJ's bedroom. The property was obviously declared a crime scene. So when all of this is happening, the police actually call OJ in Chicago to inform him of Nicole's death. He was there, by the way, for a golf tournament, in case anybody's wondering like why he was gone. It was a trip that was already planned for him to go and be in a golf tournament. I heard that it was for Hertz. I don't know if that's true, but regardless, it doesn't really matter. I just thought I'd mention it in case anybody was curious. But anyways, the cops call OJ to inform him that his wife has died. And this is one of those points in the case that's gonna make him look incredibly suspicious. When told that his wife was dead, he didn't say what happened, how did she die, nothing like this. He said, who killed her? Who killed her? Who killed her? So OJ flies back to California same day and arrives at about noon and finds police waiting for him, and he agrees to go back to the station and be interviewed. So when questioning him about his whereabouts and his alibi between his daughter's recital and leaving for Chicago, OJ doesn't really give them good answers. He keeps it very vague, which in turn makes it very difficult for police to catch him in a lie. And the police didn't press him farther in the interviews because they wanted to keep his cooperation. They knew that they would need to get his DNA in order to test against what was in the house. And he did voluntarily give them a DNA sample when they asked. And when they tested this DNA, they found that the blood drops at the crime scene belonged to OJ, and that the blood on the glove at OJ's house was a mixture of Nicole's and OJ's, which does not look good for OJ Simpson, right? Right. 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 So in the days after the murders, OJ's longtime best friend, Robert Kardashian, and yes, I did say Kardashian, there is a relation. This is the Kardashian girl's dad. Robert Kardashian is Kim Kardashian and Khloe Kardashian. All the Kardashians, this is their dad. Anyways, he had been at OJ's property with him, and while he was there, he left the property with a garment bag. And if you've ever looked at photos of this garment bag, it was clearly containing something. You can see that it is bulging. There are things inside this garment bag, but when the police got it back, because they asked for it back, obviously, it was empty. And Robert Kardashian says that he has no idea what was in it, that he never opened it. And on top of that, obviously, police would want to question him, right? He's been with OJ, he took this garment bag. They want to question him and see what he knows. But, okay, and this is very interesting, and I didn't know this either. Robert Kardashian was an attorney, but prior to OJ's arrest, he had been inactive for approximately like 20 years. And he reinstated himself, like paid what he needed to pay to get his license back, just so that he could be on OJ's defense team. But he didn't do a lot of work as far as actual defense. He was just sort of like the middle ground between OJ and his other attorneys, or so they say. So he was reinstated as an attorney to sit on as a defense attorney for OJ even though he didn't really do any work. And what this essentially means is that police can't question him because of client-attorney privilege. So I ask you this, did he reinstate just because he wanted to be helpful to a friend? I mean, that's possible, but it's also possible that he didn't want to be able to be questioned on what he knew about his best friend murdering his wife. Allegedly, that's also an option for what the reasoning could be. So 2 days after the garment bag incident, on June 16th, 1964, the funerals for both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were held. So the day after the funerals, the police actually contacted O.J. Simpson's lead attorney, which was a man named Robert Shapiro, and they said to Robert that they had a warrant for O.J.'s arrest. Since the police did not expect that O.J. was a flight risk, being that he had come back to California from Chicago without incident and had willingly given a blood test, they approved Shapiro's request to allow O.J. to surrender himself that day at 11 a.m., which is the weirdest thing to me. I've never heard of this, but apparently it's not common. This is something that they just did for O.J. It was just like a courtesy that they did. So they weren't like railroading him. They gave him the opportunity to turn himself in, but unfortunately 11 a.m. came and went, and O.J. was nowhere to be found. So that day at 2 p.m., the police announced that O.J. Simpson is a fugitive. That same day, Robert Kardashian goes on the news about, in front of reporters and reads a note that O.J. had written that sounds a lot like a suicide note. You can Google it if you want to know what it says. So at about 6:30 p.m., a police officer spots O.J.'s Bronco driving on the I-5, which is it's a freeway. Interstate 5, the 5. I know this freeway, in case you wanted to know what I know. Al Cowlings, who's gonna go by AC from here on out, was actually the person who was driving the Bronco, and he pulled the Bronco over, and the officer got out and started walking towards the car when AC started to scream out the window that OJ was in the car, that he was in the back seat, and that he had a gun to his head, and then he took off in the Bronco. And this starts the famous Bronco chase scene, which I'm sure you are at least aware of that if you're not too familiar with the case. 95 million people tuned in to watch OJ run from the police. I don't actually remember the chase, the Bronco chase, but at the time that this happened, I was 6 years old, and like car chases and the news weren't really my thing, but I know that it was very famous, and it is sort of responsible for why car chases are news now. I don't believe prior to this that people really watched them or that the news really reported them, but now that's like a thing they realized how much people like watching. So during the chase, AC only drove the Bronco about 40 to 45 miles per hour, which for the 5 is actually not that slow. That's pretty common. That freeway's pretty backed up, but anyways. During the chase, a phone call was recorded between OJ and a detective, like a negotiations detective, I believe, or just an officer. A recording was made of a phone call between OJ and an officer, and during this call, which I listened to, and OJ sounded very, very upset, he started saying that, you know, he loved Nicole and that no one deserved to be hurt but himself, sort of playing into that suicidalness that AC had said OJ had. So while OJ was on the run, many people had lined up, you know, like on the freeway how there's those bridges that go over it? Well, people were standing on those bridges along his path cheering him on. People even went as far as to make signs. I don't know who had time to make signs, but they did. They made signs and they stood there and they cheered OJ on as he ran. OJ just had this special connection with his fans, going from his upbringing to the football star to the acting star. He was just overall relatable to so many people. So they wanted what was best for him. They wanted him to win, and they kept cheering him on, which is just so weird to me. I don't know. I find that very odd, but I wasn't there, so. So the chase lasted less than 2 hours and ended back at OJ's Brentwood home. When they searched the Bronco, they found a lot of incriminating stuff. They found a fake mustache, a fake goatee, glue to attach those to his face. They found his passport, some changes of clothes, and I believe I saw it reported that they found a gun. OJ surrendered just before 9 p.m. and he was taken to he was arrested and he was put on suicide watch. So on July 18th, 1994, Johnny Cochran, who was known to do a lot of high-profile cases involving both celebrities and just civil rights cases in general, he was added to O.J. Simpson's defense team, completing what everyone then called the dream team of attorneys. So on July 22nd, 1994, O.J. Simpson pleads absolutely 100% not guilty. And on the same day, the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office released a 911 call that Nicole had made to police against OJ. I've listened to a lot of the phone calls that were recorded that Nicole made to the police, and essentially all the calls were made because OJ had been beating Nicole, threatening Nicole, breaking into her home, and harassing her. And these calls would play a huge role in the prosecution's case against O.J. Simpson. When doing a sort of like mock jury, they discovered what people in the public thought about all of the players in this case. They found that black women were more sensitive to OJ than to Nicole. They also found that black jurors thought that Marcia Clark, who was the prosecution's lead attorney at this point, they thought that she seemed like a bitch, and they thought that Robert Shapiro, who was, of course, OJ's lead attorney at this point, they thought that he seemed very smart. And smart he was, actually, because very early on in the case, Robert Shapiro called a bunch of experts that usually work with the prosecution, and though he didn't end up working with these people because he had spoken to them, these experts that are usually used were off limits to the prosecution. So though the mock jury showed the jury consultant that having several black jurors on the jury would make it difficult to get a conviction against OJ, the prosecution ignored his recommendation. Marcia felt that she was very capable of relating to black women and that she could help them feel sympathetic for Nicole's abuse. Unfortunately, throughout the case, as was warned, this was not the case. Even after the trial, a juror said that they did not believe that OJ's prior domestic abuse had anything to do with the murders. On December 8th, the 12 jurors were announced. Of the 12, there was 1 black man, 1 Latino man, 2 white women, and 8 black women. When questioned, 5 of the jurors that were selected said that they had negative feelings and connections with the police, and 5 thought that using force on a family member was acceptable. So in cases like this, the defendant has a right to a speedy trial, but in this case, OJ and his attorneys waived their right to a speedy trial, announcing ready like right away. They wanted to limit the time that the prosecution had to process their evidence, which in turn made them have less against OJ. These things take time, and this made it so the prosecution was rushed. And this was a smart move on their part, I believe, because most people waive their right to a speedy trial because they want to have a lot of time to prepare to prove that they're innocent, but I believe that they knew that if they kept looking at OJ, it wasn't gonna get better for him, you know? But either way, that's what happened. January 24th, 1995, 7 months after OJ was arrested, the trial began. Reporters from over 100 news stations showed up at the courthouse, and 3 different stations showed live footage from within the courtroom. The media was running this trial just non-stop constantly, but the jury was sequestered, so they weren't able to have access to any of the media or any people or anything. And the sequestering of the jury would prove to be sort of problematic for the prosecution, because there was evidence in this trial that could have really helped illustrate just how severe the abuse was from OJ to Nicole. For example, her diary, but it was considered to be inadmissible in court. Therefore, the jury could not see it or read it or hear what it said, which in turn, they didn't know. Duh. So the prosecution's game plan in this trial was essentially to show a pattern and escalation in OJ's abuse against Nicole that inevitably led to Nicole and Ron being murdered. And they wanted to solidify this with the mountain of physical evidence that they had against OJ. Motive, means, opportunity, and DNA evidence all being there against him. The defense went in to discredit the prosecution's timeline of events, making it seem impossible that OJ could have actually done it, given that their timeline was wrong. Additionally, they tried to paint the LAPD's handling and collection of evidence as faulty and sloppy and insufficient to sort of confuse the jury and to show the jury that mistakes were clearly made or possible to be made by the way that they were handling things, which then made it easier for the police to be mistrusted and for the police conspiracy theory to wedge its way in. So during the trial, a reporter by the name of Tubin ran an article that stated that the defense's strategy was to show that a racist LAPD officer was trying to frame OJ. Acting on a tip, the reporter was able to find that Officer Mark Furman, you remember Mark Furman, the one who hopped the fence and found the glove? Well, he had used some heavily racist remarks during a psychological evaluation that was conducted through the LAPD. So during the trial, Furman took the stand, and at this point, the prosecution now knows that the defense wants to paint Furman as being a racist. And let's be real, Furman was a racist, right? We know that he was a racist. But the prosecution did what they could to show that all of the evidence that directly linked OJ wasn't found only by Furman, in case he was mistrusted due to who he was. When the defense cross-examined Furman, they asked him flat out if he had ever used racist remarks. It was honestly the most intense and the cringiest questioning I've ever seen, because this guy used the N-word, like the attorney used the N-word way too much. Made me incredibly uncomfortable, but Furman denied ever using racist remarks. Defense also went in on the LAPD's criminalist who was handling the evidence at the scene. They focused their questions to him in a way that's going to get answers that show that the handling of the evidence was done poorly. For example, the police covered Nicole's body with a blanket that was from inside the house, and since OJ and her were together and he had been inside the house, this could cause contamination. Additionally, the criminalist didn't change gloves between samples that he was handling, and he said that it's because it wasn't protocol to do so, but it still doesn't look good when you are handling samples and not changing your gloves. And then, as if it wasn't bad enough, the worst thing that the prosecution could ever done was done by Christopher Darden, who was working as one of the prosecution's attorneys alongside Marcia Clark. Against Marcia Clark's instruction, he asked the court to have OJ try on the glove that was found at the crime scene and the glove that was found at his property. And if you know anything about this case, you know that those gloves did not fit OJ's hands. He walked right in front of the jury and tried to stuff his hand, which he had his fingers spread out, but he tried to stuff his hand into this glove, pulling on it, and it did not fit his hand. And he was wearing rubber gloves on under it, which would stop it from going on smoothly. He also had his hand extended, which would stop it from going on smoothly. And because it was being used for evidence, the glove had been frozen and unfrozen several times to preserve it, which could make the glove shrink also because of the material it was made out of. But this was just a bad move all around. Doing an experiment that you didn't know what the outcome was going to be on, and having the person who's on trial be the person who's in charge of how this experiment's going to play out, because you put it in his hands literally, and it could not be unseen. Now, all of that is pretty bad, right? Well, it's gonna get a little bit worse for the prosecution here. On July 7th, the defense received an anonymous tip that there were some cassette tapes, or not cassette, I don't know if it was cassette at that time, but there were some tapes of Mark Furman speaking, saying a lot of racist shit. Defense, of course, wanted to play these tapes in court, and after a lot of back and forth, the judge did allow for a small portion of the tape to be played to the jury. And that small amount that they played did a whole lot of damage and just destroyed Furman's credibility in one fell swoop. In this short clip, Furman used over 40 racial slurs, and in this one clip, they were able to determine that not only was Furman racist, which they wanted to prove anyway, they also showed that he had lied on the stand when he said that he never used racial slurs, which just shot anything he had to say was completely not, the jury wasn't having it, they weren't hearing it, he wasn't trustworthy. After presenting 488 pieces of evidence and interviewing 58 witnesses, the prosecution rests. Closing statements from the prosecution were pretty much just like their opening statements. They said that the past history of abuse showed a pattern of escalation in OJ that, along with the physical evidence, proved that OJ Simpson was guilty of these murders beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense's closing statement can be summed up pretty easily from the famous line from Johnny Cochran, which was, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." On October 2nd at 9 a.m., after 8 months of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury had come to a decision and a verdict was reached. But for some reason, and I don't know why, the judge decided to not read the verdict until the next day. So on average, about 2 million people watched the broadcasted trial each day, but for the reading of his verdict on October 3rd at 10 a.m., 150 million viewers tuned in to hear OJ's verdict, and more than 1,000 people stood outside of the courthouse. And even though the physical evidence was stacked so high against OJ Simpson, the blood of Nicole, Ron, and OJ being present at the crime scene, the glove at OJ's property having both his and Nicole's blood on it, the cut on OJ's hand that was present and fresh the day that he was interviewed, which was the day after the murder, the beanie left at the crime scene that contained hair that matched to OJ Simpson, the blood-soaked sock in OJ's bedroom, the blood in OJ's driveway, the bloody footprint inside the Bronco and at the crime scene that matched OJ Simpson's size of shoe that he wore and matched a pair of shoes that he was known to have, the murder weapon that matched a knife that OJ had been known to have purchased and owned that was never recovered. And on top of all of that, OJ's documented and continuous abuse of Nicole, being actually found guilty of spousal abuse in 1989. Even though all of this was pretty concrete evidence that OJ Simpson was the murderer of these two people, OJ Simpson was found not guilty by a jury of his peers and was a free man. The crowd outside roared and the media flooded the news channels with images of happy and celebrating black people and disappointed white people shaking their heads. The media made this case very much into an us versus them type of situation. So it was like your team had won. And this is exactly what the defense wanted and what they played into throughout this case. These images of the two separate races' reactions to the verdict is a very clear example of the obvious racial divide in the experiences when it comes to interactions with the police. Of course, the idea of a conspiracy to frame OJ Simpson, a black man, is going to be a lot less likely to be believed and received by a community of white people who do not have the same experience on the day-to-day as black people. Obviously. The overall experience for a white person in America isn't constant injustice and constant harassment the way it is for our black community. So it's a lot harder for them to believe. Does that make sense? Am I expressing myself well? The cheers that were being heard in the streets were cheers for the black community in general. The same justice system that continually holds them down and harasses them and encages their brothers and sisters has now set this man free. A CNN poll at the time that this happened perfectly captures this divide, with 75% of white people believing that OJ Simpson was guilty, while 78% of black people polled believed he was innocent. Though those numbers have drastically changed over the years now that there's been more time between the two cases and it can be looked at objectively in all the evidence seen. I did my own poll prior to this video on my Instagram stories, and 96% of people believed that he was guilty. And the timing of all of this happening, I believe, has a lot to do with the outcome of this case. The defense brought race into this case because Los Angeles had then and continues to have now a long history of racial conflict and injustice. And in this trial, the verdict came right off the heels of the Rodney King beatings. Well, let's call it what it was, the Rodney King attempted murder and the riots that followed that. The community was in an uproar for social justice and was raw from seeing what had happened, first off to Rodney King, and then seeing how the officers who beat him within an inch of his life were acquitted of the charges. The fact that these officers could publicly and without fear of any consequence beat this man within an inch of his life was just, it was just too much. And all of this occurred just 2 years before the O.J. Simpson trial. Because of this case, major changes were put into effect in the ways that forensics are handled. Labs have standardized the collection, processing, and storage of evidence in cases in general. In addition, a California criminal law has changed because during the time of this trial, Nicole's diary was not admissible in the trial, but now there is a law in place that makes these types of things admissible in future hearings. In 1995, Ron Goldman's family filed a civil suit against O.J. Simpson for the wrongful death of Ron Goldman, and only a month later, Nicole's family followed suit. Evidence that was inadmissible at the murder trial was able to be presented at the civil trial. For example, the type of shoe that O.J. had been wearing at the time of the murders had never been recovered, but they were able to determine the size and the make of the shoe, and there had been less than 300 pairs of these shoes sold in the U.S. period, and O.J., when he was being deposed, was like, oh, I would never own those ugly-ass shoes. But then he was shown a photo of himself wearing those shoes 9 months prior to the murders. And bro, I saw the recording of his reaction. If I can screenshot it, I'll put it up on the screen for you. He was just like, whew. Anyways, the jury found OJ liable for both Ron and Nicole's deaths, and he was ordered to pay $33.5 million to the families, but to this day, he has not paid anything, as far as I know. And additionally, California law protects his $25,000 a month NFL pension, and he has coincidentally moved to Florida, where state law in Florida protects his home from being seized for the death videos. Coincidental. Now, OJ did end up getting arrested in 2007. He was found guilty of a robbery in Las Vegas, I believe, and he was sentenced to 33 years in prison for this crime, but I believe he was let out in less than 10, and he, I believe, is already free. Yeah, because less than 10, it's 2020. He's free. Now, I gotta talk to you about the book and the subsequent interview with OJ Simpson before we get into like some heavy thoughts and like the wrap up, okay? Okay. So this book, dude, it's called If I Did It, and it's written by O.J. Simpson. Initially, this book was not going to be published because there was an obvious public outrage at the idea that he'd write this book in general, but I believe it was able to be published because all of the proceeds are going to go to Ron Goldman's family. That's the way I understand it. Anyways, he did an interview in 2006 with Fox about the book. And if you have not seen this interview and you are interested in this case, you need to watch it. I will link the video. I watched one of the videos I watched. I'll link it down below for you because, man, he hypothetically admits to the murders of Nicole and Ron. He starts by saying that, to remember, this is hypothetical because he wrote the book coming from the idea if he had done it. So it's all hypothetical. But as he starts talking and he gets more comfortable, he starts to kind of lose that structured, held in thing to him, and he starts to get more fluid in the way he speaks, and he starts to slip up and not be as careful with his words. He starts saying things like, I remember how angry I was, and I remember that Nicole was listening to music so she couldn't hear me and didn't know I was there. Things like that. And honestly, it's eerie to listen to because you can tell that, I mean, if you didn't, like, you know he did it, but you can tell in this interview that he did it, and I feel like this book was just kind of like, you know what I mean? Like, look at me, I did it, and what are you gonna do about it? Nothing. And this is how I did it, and what are you gonna do? Nothing. And whew, it's a lot. I highly suggest watching it. So let's get into the wrap up here, which I have a lot to say. So for the idea of this conspiracy of the police framing OJ to work, the police would have to first decide in their minds that he's guilty and that they want to do this, right? And they'd have to be willing to risk their jobs to frame him without first knowing if he had like a rock solid alibi that would make everything they were doing pointless and also obvious that it was a frame. Then they would have to take the glove from the crime scene, ensuring that it had blood evidence on it, and drive it over to OJ's house. And then they'd somehow have to get inside his Bronco, because remember, there was blood evidence in there as well. There was blood in the car, and there was a footprint, a bloody footprint in the car. And they'd have to plant that evidence somehow with those special shoes and all. And then Furman would have to go into the back behind the guest house and plant that glove that contained both Nicole's blood and OJ's blood. And remember, they didn't take OJ's blood till the next day, but somehow they had OJ's blood, and he planted that behind the guest house. They'd have to plant both Nicole and Ron's blood inside OJ's house and soak one of OJ's socks in that blood, and have to go and make sure to get OJ's blood back to Nicole's house. That's what would have had to happen for this scenario to be plausible. Okay? Sounds outrageous, right? It does. But as far-fetched as this sounds, you have to try to understand how the jury was perceiving this situation. The defense was able to prove that the officer who found a lot of the evidence was a racist and had lied on the stand. So what else could he have lied about? And then discrediting the methods of evidence collection and storage was able to put doubt into the jurors' minds about possible contamination in general. Those things being put before a jury where the majority of the people on that jury live every day knowing how unjust and how unjustly they abuse their power against them, their sisters, and more importantly, their brothers. It didn't matter that there was that much evidence against OJ. It didn't matter that the abuse against Nicole got so common that when she would call the police, she would just give her address and say, "He's here again." It didn't matter that the shoes and the knife that OJ had been proven to have owned were nowhere to be found. It didn't matter that OJ's blood and hair and DNA was all over that crime scene, and it didn't matter that poor Nicole and Ron's blood was all over OJ's house and car and yard. Because these jurors had no trust and faith in the police who were claiming that this evidence was real and true. And though I do wholeheartedly believe that OJ Simpson killed Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, I can totally sympathize, if not empathize, with the fact that these Black Americans did not trust the evidence that they were being presented with because they couldn't trust the source that it was coming from. And that is on our police departments. That is on our justice system that to this day continues to oppress, criminalize, and murder Black people every single day. No wonder there's trauma and a lack of trust. That is on our system, and that's why I think it's still important to upload this video now. If there had been reform in our justice system and Black Americans had had an evil playing field within their country and within our system at the time that these crimes took place, I do not believe that OJ Simpson would be a free man today. That's that, and it's an issue that we're still dealing with. It is an issue that our Black brothers and sisters are still dealing with, and it has become just more and more prevalent and more eye-opening in the last several months. Okay, I hope this wasn't too heavy, but I think it was because I have goosebumps right now myself. I just feel really strongly, and it's incredibly disheartening. And if it's disheartening to me, I can't even imagine, you know? And please, please, please do not come here with any All Lives Matter comments, because point blank, no one said they didn't, period. And I just feel so bad for Ron and Nicole and their families. Like 25? He was 25. That's so young. That's a baby. And 35? She was 35 years old. That's the same age as my husband. It's only a couple years older than me. That's such a weird thing. And all she wanted to do was get away from him, and she couldn't, and he killed her, allegedly. And then he got to write a book about it, and he's literally, in my opinion, just shoving it in your face. Like, yeah, I did it, and this is how I did it. And what are you gonna do about it? Nothing. And then to move to a state, coincidentally, where all of his assets are protected so he doesn't have to pay back the families he destroyed. He's just the worst. That's so gross, and just, he's just out there living his life like nothing ever happened, and that sucks. OJ Simpson is absolutely 100% guilty as hell in my mind. Prove me wrong. So okay guys, that completes this video. I hope that it was informative and made sense, and of course I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know any videos you would like to see. I have an ongoing list of cases, but I would love to add your ideas because I just know that you have good ideas. I know that. Of course, make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss any future videos. And if you want to be included in polls or see like spoilers of upcoming videos, my Instagram is Bratterstein. I post on my story there. And that's it. I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else on the internet. That's tight, you're tight, and I hope to see you in my next video.